Alrighty folks, I want to welcome you back for another video of Yates Computers Tips and Reviews from Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. This year, 2023, I've dedicated it to the rabbit hole. So all of these videos are going to be kind of more in depth. This video is going to be part of the last video of Hyper-V. The next video will be about setting up the virtual OS. After that, I'll probably do some screen capture videos of actually how to configure it and how to go through it. Because this was really one of the ones that took me a lot of time to go through and figure out the variables and the different settings of your physical NIC, virtual NIC, virtual switches, and a virtual NIC, and a virtual NIC. It kind of gets into, this is why it's the rabbit hole. It gets pretty deep, gets pretty wild. Gets into NAT, network address translations, gets into DHCP, gets into fixed IPs, gets into a lot of stuff. Private communications, token ring type of a network. You can got lots of different network setups you can do. How, where, how, and there's a lot of variables that start coming into play there when you start going down this road. So the first thing about a virtual network that I will say is it is not the same as a standalone network. It's completely different. The way I ended up setting this up is completely different. Same hardware. The comparison that I put out to relate to other people is consider this like a video card. This is your hardware now. When you have a video card, you put your video card in, you put your drivers in, and you go to your OS and you change the settings. It's now in two physical different locations where with the NIC, you would install the NIC, you'd go to your network settings, you could set in, I want a physical IP on this, or I want this, or I want that on here. Where you want it to communicate. Once you go virtual, this ends up being like your video card. Ends up being over here, and then you have your controls over here. Where they were both before together, they're now separated. And you'll see once you set that up, and once you see the videos, I'll explain what I'm talking about right here. Because now you end up with the NIC in there, and you end up with a virtual NIC. And by default, it turns off pretty much everything on here. So all your settings that were here are now on your virtual NIC settings. I know this will be complicated for a lot of home users. But odds are, if you're a home user, you probably won't be doing this. Because you need the upgraded OS, the upgrading operating system to turn this feature on. There are other pieces of software out there you can download that are free, that will do basically the same thing. But this is more an environment for business and deployment, not really home users. I cannot really think of a real practical use for a home user to want to set this up, other than, like I mentioned in the other video, if you want to set up a security server. Then you might want to consider having a virtual server, or you would just go out and buy a new computer and you set it up on that. I mentioned it on Hyper-V video, some of those scenarios of where you could put it, why you would want to do it. But this is the actual NIC setup. This is the network setup, how you set that up. And what was really interesting to me is once you got into the Hyper-V software, you got into your physical, your software that controls it. I'm going to compare it to like a video card. And then you have another piece of software that talks to that piece of software. And how you configure that piece of software in the Hyper-V actually will do lots of different things that I thought was really kind of interesting. And a lot of it I had to research to figure out, which do I really, really want? Do I want some of these features? Do I not want some of these features? How do I want this set up? How do I want that set up? How many virtual systems am I going to have on here? What IPs? Is it going to be a fixed IP that I'm going to need to be able to communicate into? Are these, what kind of systems are they? If it's, you have a security server and you have to have a couple virtuals with it to work with that security server, that was one of the ones that I was setting up. So that one really did not need to have this computer to log into that software. That software is a standalone piece of software that then talks to the other virtual server. That then does all the, then talks to other systems and then talks to all the other computers. So if you're setting up just one thing like that, you might want to choose a different setting. But if you're going to set up multiple virtual servers, then you have to choose a different setting because of what they all are going to need. So it was really kind of an interesting thing, and it took me a long time to actually draw out the network configuration for the virtual server. It is as bad as a home network, but it's all done right here. And if you've done them, or you've looked at them, or you've played with them, you're going to understand exactly what I'm telling you. And it was really kind of an interesting thing of how much this little component would do with that software. Basically, you can turn this unit into something physically like this. Or one of these. And what's interesting with that setup, and I have these laid out so I can try to show you physical hardware, because if that's the way you know your network, by the physical hardware, me giving you a architectural blueprint with switch and routers and the icons that you don't even realize what they are and have to explain all that gets really intense. You're going to have to go back and follow a lot of training courses and a lot of other things to understand even the layout. So I'm trying to do it both ways so you can understand what is going on. So in the system, you have your physical NIC that cable comes into to your network that is actually attached to your computer. How you configure that software on Hyper-V will make this thing act like this or even this. Depending on how you lay that out will depend on how these actually communicate. Are they talking in parallel to each other, or is one behind the other? And that was a concept that took me a little bit to kind of figure out in the settings, like what is going on and why is this doing that and why is this doing this. It took me a while to figure a lot of this out, to figure out these settings. And it was very interesting to figure this out, because you can have the network cable come in here to your system that I have here, assign it an IP address, that then this system, only this system, can talk to those virtual systems. Or those virtual systems can talk to each other and not talk to this system. All off of this one little card, off one network cable. Or you can actually set it up So it acts like this, but you only have one cable. You have your one cable that comes in, and that splits out to your system. You can assign it an IP. You can have 4 virtual systems running on there, and they will all communicate out here. How you give them IPs or where you give them IPs, a lot of that comes in later down the road. That was one of the longest ones for me to figure out, is how do I assign this an IP for the physical computer and then assign IPs for the other computers. It was really easy to set up the DHCP, but it took me a little bit of writing things down and, you know, marking it and going, oh, okay, now I see, because you could do this setting, or you could do that setting, or you do this, you could do that. There's really only 4. But they have different settings and they do different things. Different features. So I wanted to go through some of that. The internal, external, local, and there's the default. So I will go through more of that in the videos, but I wanted to go through and explain how the virtual NICs actually are with hardware. What hardware that actually can do. I mean, it's not a new concept. It's been out there. It's just, I haven't used it. There was no need for me to do it. I know there's a lot of people that do it. Now, it's a big thing on a lot of servers to do all of that type of stuff. Virtual servers are nice to have. Especially if you have the licenses, you have the software, you have everything to do it with. But I do want to explain that you do need the licenses. It's another version of Windows. You're going to have to activate it. You're going to have to do all of those type of things. You know, Linux, Unix, Windows, whatever, Ubuntu, whatever you want to run on that, you can run on them. So I wanted to go through that and touch base on that, because the reason I'm throwing all those out is you might be asking, well, why do I need so many? You mentioned 4 virtuals and the physical. There's a lot of different reasons why. Like I said, security pieces of software. You might have a security agent type of monitoring. You might have actual update servers. You might have a communication server. You might have all kinds of other servers that are running to handle that. So I wanted to specify that when you do this, so you don't think you're limited to just 1 or 2 little things. Of course, you don't want to run a whole bunch of virtual servers off of that one port, because you're going to fill the bandwidth of it. So again, that's when it comes into the multiple port NICs. The one thing that I found is make sure you know exactly what each port is labeled, even the single NIC, because I've mentioned already, your virtual NIC, your virtual NICs, all these things get set up in the system. Before you know, you can go from 1 to about 8 or 9 NIC configurations on your computer. Knowing how that's set up, and the systems I'm working on with, you know, 3 NICs on 3 different networks, and then they have, you know, 4 different virtual NICs. You get into 12, 15 NICs onto that thing real quick. So you got to make sure you're organized. You know what each thing is. When you go into IP config, it's going to show you a bunch of information. It's going to show you the names. It's going to show you the IPs and all that type of stuff. So it was very interesting to see all of that develop. To understand what it all is. To understand what settings to do, what settings not to do. Because if you set something in there, it's going to affect the other things in there. What not to set, what to set. IP addresses for virtual machines. If you want to do a fixed IP on a virtual machine, you do it on the virtual machine, not on the NIC. I wanted to elaborate that because that took me a lot of time to figure out, like, okay, I can give the host computer, oh, everybody going by out on the street, I can give the host computer a physical IP address by the NIC. The host computer is the actual computer running the Hyper-V or virtual software. You can give that the virtual stuff. You do that in the OS itself. You log in, you tell it, okay, this NIC, this IP, this gateway, this subnet, all of this type of stuff goes on there. So I wanted to specify that because that took me a long time to find that information, to understand that information, to understand it. How come, depending on what settings you do, you can do that. There's other settings where you don't give that NIC that kind of IP address. Some of them, it'll do network translations. It'll do the setting I have set up. You can actually give it physical IP addresses, but it's still doing network translations. But it all works. But knowing it when you see it, when you do an IP config, you're going to see all kinds of stuff pop up. So it's something to be aware of, to know what it is, what it isn't. I went through and different NICs, if I don't need virtual on them, I went through and disabled the virtual. Went through and disabled things so that I cleaned up everything and only have what's running what I need to have running. So that was one of the things that I saw that was kind of interesting, as it seemed to develop a lot of stuff that you got to kind of go back through and clean up. But then the secondary thing is, as I said, network translation. NAT. That is basically what this does. You have your internet line that comes in, your network line that comes in, you have all your ports that go out, and they go out to your different computers. That's basically what this is doing. That gives it an IP. So that's what your switches do, your routers do, your basic routers. Not really switches, but your routers. You can have it like in a hub mode where you give it physical IPs and it knows, and it doesn't use this to translate in a private connection. You can do a lot of things that I thought was really kind of interesting. So I wanted to do a video and explain and show you a little bit of this before I get into doing a screen capture of it and show you, and not understand when you change the settings, you have one. Usually you have one physical connection. And that's going to be a little hard to grasp and get and figure out. But when you're in a server environment, you're in a controller environment, you're going to be running more like a 4-port NIC. Maybe 2 of these have 8. You're going to have different networks, different things that plug in. And they're subnetted off, and they're all different networks, so that this network doesn't talk to that network, but you need this system here, like the little one I bought had 2 NICs. So I could hook up 2 lines for 2 different networks that are subnetted and do a lot of things with that. So that's what's interesting, and that's what, go back and watch that video on the computer that I got for in here to do my capture videos. So, gardeners. Wanting to go through some of this stuff so that people understand the physical hardware that I'm talking about later on in the virtual stuff. That this is what most people will be using, is a single port NIC. You might have a double. I doubt anybody's going to have a 4-port unless you're running servers or anything like that. And to be aware, if you're running a single or double, you're going to end up with more virtual NICs. You're going to end up with a bunch of stuff on there. Understanding what you are actually starting with as a single NIC, understanding the virtuals and how all of that stuff gets set up, understanding your settings is is the NIC card in front of your switch or parallel? Seem to be the biggest part of it. Or what's weird on the virtual network is, does this even exist? You might have a virtual network that would be considered private that has basically a switch in there. Because you might have 4 or 5 virtual servers running on there on a private network. So that's why I'm saying it's on a switch, because it's how you would set up a switch. You'd run it on all your lines, and they would communicate to each other privately. But there's no network lines, because they're communicating in the system. They're not going out on the network cable. So that's what's kind of the weird thing, is they communicate that way. This will help control the traffic, so it will kind of need the network cable, because it's really, that's what it's there for. It's not really using this cable, it's using what's in your card. So it's communicating through the network card all around. So it's really kind of interesting when I got into that to figure out, okay, how do I want this oriented? You can have a virtual switch with this, another, and it gets into a little bit of a complicated thing, and I wanted to go through that and express some of those things. And again, you have ways to set up the network. Let's say, does that server need internet? If it needs internet, there's the default and external settings that will give it internet. Internal network means it'll talk to the things on your network. Private network means it talks to the virtual servers only on that. No NIC card, no host. So that was some of the things that really threw me off, is the host had a job to do too on the network. So figuring out the right settings so that the host and the virtual servers are all functioning was part of it. Because probably most people that set up virtual servers, the host computer probably is not going to be a server. It's not going to be doing a function on the network. But this system was, because it wasn't really a hard-used server. It's not a domain controller. It's not anything like that. It has some security purposes running on it, and these were add-ons to that. So, wanted to go through that and express that, because to me, I thought that was an interesting concept, because I always think a virtual server, I've shown you physical hardware servers. You load your OS, you load your Hyper-V or whatever software you're going to use the virtual servers. Load all your virtual servers on there. You load your mail, you load your DC, you load your security agents, you load all of that. But you don't run it off of the basic hardware. This was already set up to run, and these things were added to it. So I really thought, well, that's an interesting concept, because now, if you're running something at home, a media center or any of those type of things, and you're running XP on there, or not XP, Professional on there, you can then put that virtual server on there to add more to it, to make that system more valuable to you and a better resource to you, because now that media center is running all the time, you can actually have it do other functions without going back in and say, okay, remove all the media center stuff and reinstall and put a virtual server on for your media center, put a virtual server on for this, and it made it more of an expandable thing to me. That really, that's why I'm doing this video for everybody, because it's going to be handy for small businesses especially. Let me pause this for a few minutes. Well, for small businesses, because that's the expandability. You can add to it. So, let me wrap this one up, and hopefully I've explained the hardware enough, And hopefully I can get into screen captures and all that here in the next couple videos, and you can actually see the physical, how you do it. Alrighty, I want to thank everybody for watching another Yates video. Of course, from Yates Computers Tips and Reviews. Make sure you head over and hit subscribe. Got to get the subscriptions up. Stick around. There's more coming. Hopefully this is a subject that a lot of people will find interesting and are interested in. Again, this is part of the Rabbit Hole Collection of 2023. Thank you.